The flames rose higher against the darkening Arizona sky, painting the world in shades of orange and crimson. Black smoke billowed upward, carrying with it the scent of burning wood fabric and flesh. The Apache village was being consumed by fire, its people scattered like leaves in a windstorm. Screams pierced the evening air, mingling with the crack of rifles and the thundering of hooves. Atop a low hill overlooking the carnage stood a solitary figure, a white man with broad shoulders and a weathered face. His piercing blue eyes reflected the dancing flames below. In his hand, he held a Winchester rifle, its barrel still warm. Vernon Holloway watched the destruction with a face carved from stone, betraying nothing of the turmoil within. A flash of movement caught his eye, an Apache man bleeding from a wound in his side, desperately running toward the cover of rocks at the edge of the village. Vernon raised his rifle, the sights finding the man's back with practiced ease. His finger hovered over the trigger. The Apache man glanced back, his eyes meeting Vernon's across the distance. For a heartbeat, the world stood still. Vernon lowered his rifle. The man disappeared among the rocks. "Holloway!" a voice called out from behind him. Captain Reynolds of the Arizona Territorial Militia approached on horseback, his uniform dusty and spattered with blood. "Report." "Village secure, Captain," Vernon replied, his voice as dry as the desert around them. "Most of the warriors are dead or captured." Reynolds nodded approvingly. "Good work. Here's the bounty for your group." He tossed a small leather pouch that clinked with the sound of coins. "Bishop Walsh will be pleased." Vernon caught the pouch without comment, tucking it into his vest pocket. As Reynolds rode away to join the others, Vernon felt a prickling sensation at the back of his neck, the feeling of being watched. He turned slowly, scanning the scrubby vegetation that dotted the hillside. There, partially hidden behind a withered juniper, stood a young Apache girl, no more than 8 years old, with large dark eyes that held no tears, only a burning intensity that seemed to pierce through Vernon's very soul. She stared at him, memorizing his face, committing every detail to memory. Vernon stared back, his hand unconsciously moving to his rifle. The girl didn't run. She didn't cower. She simply watched him, as if branding his image into her mind forever. After a long moment, Vernon turned away, mounting his horse with practiced ease. As he rode toward the gathering militia, he didn't look back. But he could still feel those eyes upon him, following him, judging him. He would remember those eyes for years to come. 12 years later, 1883, the desert sun beat down mercilessly on the parched earth of the Arizona Territory. Heat waves danced across the horizon, distorting the distant mountains into wavering mirages. In this harsh landscape, a lone figure ran desperately across the unforgiving terrain, bare feet, bleeding from countless cuts inflicted by sharp rocks and thorny plants. Nita's lungs burned with each ragged breath. The tattered remains of her St. Catherine's uniform, a drab gray dress now torn and filthy, offered little protection against the elements. Her once long black hair had been cut short in the school's effort to civilize her, but even in its shortened state, it clung to her sweat-drenched face and neck. Behind her, faint but growing closer, came the sound she dreaded most: hoofbeats and men's voices. The search party from St. Catherine's Academy for Indian Education wouldn't give up easily. She was property in their eyes, an investment of federal money and Christian charity that couldn't be allowed to escape. Nita's foot caught on a hidden rock, sending her tumbling down a small incline. Pain shot through her ankle as she landed awkwardly, a cry escaping her cracked lips. For a moment, she lay there, dust coating her skin, blood seeping from fresh scrapes on her palms and knees. "Get up," she whispered to herself in Apache, the forbidden language that had earned her countless lashes at St. Catherine's. Get up or die here. In the distance, dark clouds gathered on the horizon, an approaching dust storm, massive and threatening. In her people's stories, such storms sometimes carried spirits, both protective and malevolent. Right now, Nita would welcome either kind if they might hide her from her pursuers. She forced herself to her feet, wincing as her injured ankle protested. The voices behind her grew louder. They were gaining on her. The first gusts of wind from the approaching storm whipped at her clothes, carrying stinging particles of sand. Nita limped forward each step of fresh agony. The storm loomed larger now, a towering wall of dust that would soon engulf everything in its path. Her strength was failing. 12 hours of running with barely any water had drained her beyond endurance. The school had taught her many things she didn't want to know, but had taken from her the survival skills of her people. She was caught between worlds belonging to neither. As the leading edge of the dust storm reached her, visibility dropped to mere feet. The air became thick with particles, making each breath a struggle. Nita pulled a strip of cloth torn from her dress across her mouth and nose, but it did little to help. The wind howled around her, a deafening roar that at least drowned out the sounds of pursuit. But it also disoriented her, making it impossible to maintain direction. Each step became a battle against the storm's fury. Mother, Father, ancestors, she prayed in Apache, the words a mere whisper lost in the tempest. Guide me, or take me to you. The world narrowed to a brown haze of swirling dust and pain. Nita stumbled forward, no longer running, but merely staggering from one footfall to the next. Her vision began to darken at the edges. When her legs finally gave out, she collapsed to the ground, curling into a ball as the storm raged around her. The dust began to cover her like a blanket, a burial shroud for the living. Her last conscious thought was that perhaps this was a kinder death than returning to St. Catherine's. Then darkness claimed her. Vernon Holloway had lived alone in his small ranch for so long that he sometimes went days without speaking a word. The modest property, tucked away in a forgotten corner of the Arizona Territory, suited him well, far enough from civilization to avoid unwanted company, but close enough to make occasional supply runs to the nearest town. At 62, Vernon's once strong frame had begun to show signs of age. His hair had turned completely gray, and deep lines etched his weathered face. But his blue eyes remained sharp, missing nothing, and his hands were still steady, whether wielding a hammer or a gun. When the dust storm hit, Vernon secured his livestock in the barn and retreated to the safety of his cabin. He'd seen many such storms in his years in Arizona and knew better than to be caught outside. The wind howled like a living thing, rattling the shutters and sending fine dust seeping through every tiny crack in the walls. As night fell and the storm showed no signs of abating, Vernon sat by his fireplace nursing a glass of whiskey and cleaning an old Colt revolver, more from habit than necessity. The weapon hadn't been fired in anger for years, but old habits died hard. Morning brought an eerie silence as the storm finally passed. The world outside was transformed familiar landmarks, buried or altered by drifts of dust and sand. Vernon stepped onto his porch, surveying the damage. His water trough was completely filled with dust. The corral fence had partially collapsed. It would be a long day of repairs. He was checking on his horses when he noticed unusual tracks in the newly deposited dust boot prints, several sets heading east. Someone had passed near his property during the storm or in its immediate aftermath. Vernon frowned. He rarely had visitors, and liked it that way. Curiosity and caution warred within him. Finally, he saddled his chestnut mare and decided to investigate. Following the tracks was difficult, as they were already being erased by the persistent wind, but Vernon had been a tracker in his younger days. Some skills never faded entirely. About a mile from his ranch, something caught his eye. A small, dark shape half buried in the dust. As he approached, the shape resolved into a human form. A young woman, by the looks of her small frame, lay curled on her side. Her skin was dark, her features unmistakably Native American Apache, if he had to guess. She wore what remained of a gray dress that he recognized as the uniform from St. Catherine's Academy. A runaway. Vernon dismounted slowly, approaching with caution. He'd encountered enough desperate people in his life to know that even the seemingly helpless could be dangerous. But as he knelt beside her, it was clear she posed no threat. Her breathing was shallow, her skin hot with fever. Without help, she wouldn't survive long. For a long moment, Vernon stood motionless, internal conflict playing across his features. Taking in a runaway Indian student was asking for trouble, the kind of trouble he'd spent years avoiding. The sensible thing would be to leave her to ride away and forget he'd ever seen her. But something in her face, young yet marked by suffering, stirred something long dormant within him. With a resigned sigh, he carefully lifted her onto his horse, then mounted behind her, supporting her limp form as he turned back toward his ranch. "Foolishness," he muttered to himself as they rode. "Nothing but foolishness." Yet he didn't turn back. Consciousness returned to Nita slowly in fragmented pieces. First came awareness of sensation lying on something soft rather than the hard desert floor, a cool cloth on her forehead. Then sounds filtered in, the crackle of a fire, the distant nickering of horses. Finally, she opened her eyes to an unfamiliar ceiling of rough-hewn wooden beams. She tried to move, and immediately regretted it, pain lancing through her body. Every muscle protested, her skin felt raw and abraded, and her throat burned with thirst. "Don't try to get up." The voice, deep and gravelly, came from her right. Nita turned her head slowly to see a white man seated in a chair a few feet away. Old, with gray hair and a stern face lined by years in the sun. He regarded her with piercing blue eyes that seemed to evaluate and assess. Fear surged through her. Was he from St. Catherine's? Had they found her after all? "Water," he said, offering a tin cup. "Drink slowly." Nita hesitated, eyeing the cup suspiciously. "It's just water," he said, impatience edging his voice. "If I wanted to harm you, I wouldn't have brought you here." Thirst overcame caution. Nita reached for the cup with trembling hands, but couldn't manage to hold it steady. Without comment, the man held it to her lips, allowing her small sips. "Where?" Her voice came out as a croak. She swallowed and tried again. "Where am I?" "My ranch. Found you half buried in sand after the storm passed." He set the empty cup aside. "You're running from St. Catherine's." It wasn't a question, but Nita tensed, nonetheless, eyes darting toward the door, measuring the distance. The man snorted. "You can barely sit up. Don't waste what little strength you have on foolish escape attempts." "Are you taking me back?" Nita asked, forcing out the words in English, a language that still felt foreign on her tongue despite years of forced practice. "Not my business what you do or where you go." He stood, moving to a small stove where a pot bubbled. "But those looking for you know these lands. They'll find you if you're not careful." Nita watched him warily as he ladled some broth into a bowl. "Why help me?" The man returned, offering the bowl. When Nita couldn't sit up properly, he awkwardly helped arrange her against the wall, movements stiff and unpracticed, as if unused to providing care. "Eat," he said, ignoring her question. You need strength. As Nita slowly consumed the simple broth, she studied her surroundings. She was in a small, sparsely furnished cabin. A table, few chairs, a fireplace with cooking implements. A rifle hung on the wall near the door, alongside a gun belt with a holster. No decorations, no personal touches. Nothing to suggest anything about the man who lived here. "What's your name?" she finally asked. The man hesitated, as if weighing whether to answer. "Vernon Holloway." "I am Nita." She didn't offer her school-given name, Lucy. That name belonged to Saint. Catherine's to Bishop Walsh, and his mission to strip away everything that made her Apache. "Rest," Vernon said, taking the empty bowl. "Those men looking for you might pass by here. Better if you're not seen." He moved to the door, pausing with his hand on the latch. "I'll be outside seeing to chores. Don't try to leave. In your condition, the desert will kill you before you get 5 miles. With that, he was gone, leaving Nita alone with her thoughts and fears. She had no reason to trust this white man. For as long as she could remember, white men had brought nothing but suffering to her people. First the soldiers who destroyed her village, then the missionaries who took her to St. Catherine's, where they cut her hair, forbade her language, and beat her whenever she failed to properly recite the Bible verses they forced upon her. But she was too weak to run, and Vernon was right. She wouldn't survive long in her current state. For now, she would rest, recover her strength, and watch for any sign that he planned to return her to the school. Exhaustion soon overtook her, and Nita drifted back into an uneasy sleep, dreaming of dust storms and pursuing horsemen, and a figure watching impassively from a hillside as her world burned. 3 days passed in a strange, uneasy truce. Vernon tended to Nita's injuries with gruff efficiency, providing food and clean water, but offering little conversation. He spent most daylight hours outside, returning only to check on her and prepare meals. By the 4th day, Nita was strong enough to stand and move around the small cabin. Her ankle still throbbed with a dull pain, but the fever had broken, and the worst of her cuts and scrapes had begun to heal. That evening, Vernon returned to find her standing by the window, gazing out at the sunset, painting the desert in gold and crimson. "Feeling better," he observed, setting down a basket of vegetables harvested from his small garden. Nita nodded. "Thank you for the medicines." Vernon grunted acknowledgement as he began preparing a simple stew. "There's clean clothes in that chest. Might be too big, but better than what you're wearing." Nita looked down at her filthy, tattered school uniform. "Whose clothes?" "Just clothes," Vernon replied, not looking up from his work. "Been here longer than I remember." Nita sensed the deflection but didn't press. She limped to the wooden chest he'd indicated and found several sets of worn but serviceable garments, men's clothing by the look of them, but as Vernon had said, anything would be better than the hated uniform. As night fell and they ate dinner in silence, Nita finally gathered the courage to ask the question that had been haunting her. "Why are you helping me?" Vernon continued, eating eyes on his bowl, for so long that Nita thought he might ignore the question entirely. "Got no love for St. Catherine's," he finally said, "or for Bishop Walsh." "You know him?" Vernon's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "We've crossed paths." Nita sensed there was more to the story, but Vernon's tone discouraged further questions. Instead, she asked, "Will you send me away when I'm healed?" Vernon set down his spoon, meeting her eyes directly for perhaps the first time. "You're free to go whenever you want. Not keeping you prisoner here." "But you said the desert—" "When you're strong enough," he clarified. "You're free to go, or stay till you figure out where to go next. Makes no difference to me." But something in his tone suggested it did make a difference, though whether he preferred her to stay or go remained unclear. After dinner, Vernon sat on the porch, the soft, mournful notes of a harmonica drifting through the evening air. Nita stood in the doorway, listening to the haunting melody that seemed to capture the vastness and loneliness of the desert night. The music spoke of sorrow, of regret, of a soul carrying burdens too heavy to name. As the notes rose and fell with the desert wind, Nita found herself wondering about the solitary man who had saved her life. What ghosts haunted him? What history had etched those deep lines into his weathered face? Vernon seemed to sense her presence, but he didn't stop playing. For nearly an hour they remained that way. Vernon lost in his music, Nita listening from the shadows, two strangers connected by circumstance, but separated by a chasm of history and mistrust. When the last note faded into the night, Vernon pocketed the harmonica without a word and returned to the cabin. He laid out a bedroll near the fireplace for himself, having given Nita the cabin's only bed during her recovery. "Sleep well," he said simply, his back to her as he prepared for rest. Nita returned to the bed, but sleep eluded her. Outside, coyotes called to one another across the vast expanse of desert. Their voices, wild and free, made her heart ache with longing for her lost people, her lost way of life. In the dim light, she clutched the small wooden amulet hidden in the tattered remains of her uniform, a tiny carved fetish her mother had given her long ago, the only possession from her previous life that the school hadn't managed to take away. She had kept it hidden for years, this last tenuous connection to her heritage. "Guide me," she whispered in Apache so quietly that Vernon couldn't possibly hear. "Show me the path forward." But the spirits, if they heard, offered no immediate answer. As days stretched into a week, Nita's strength returned. Her ankle healed enough to walk without limping, and the desert sun restored color to her skin after years of confinement at St. Catherine's. Each day she ventured a little further from the cabin, reacquainting herself with the freedom of open spaces. Vernon maintained his distance, but Nita noticed how his watchful eyes followed her movements, alert for any sign of returning weakness, or perhaps for approaching riders. He worked constantly, mending fences, tending livestock, repairing storm damage, speaking little but observing much. On the 8th day, curiosity overcame caution. While Vernon was out checking his cattle, Nita explored the cabin more thoroughly. Most of it was exactly as it appeared, simple, functional, devoid of personal touches. But a small door at the back, secured with a padlock, piqued her interest. The lock was old, its mechanism simple. Using a hairpin she'd found in a drawer, Nita worked at it patiently until it clicked open. The door creaked as she pushed it open, revealing a small storage room illuminated by a single dust-covered window. What she found inside made her breath catch. The room contained a collection of Apache artifacts, intricately beaded necklaces, a medicine pouch decorated with porcupine quills, several ceremonial arrows, even a small drum. These weren't cheap trinkets or tourist souvenirs. These were authentic sacred items that belonged with her people. Nita's hands trembled as she lifted a necklace, running her fingers over the familiar pattern of beads. How had Vernon acquired these? Why would a solitary white rancher keep a hidden collection of Apache ceremonial objects? "That's not your concern." Nita whirled around to find Vernon standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. She hadn't heard him return. "Where did you get these?" she demanded, anger overcoming fear. "These belong to my people." Vernon's eyes narrowed. "Put it back and close the door. These are sacred items. Did you steal them? Are you a grave robber?" Each question came louder than the last, as years of suppressed rage found an outlet. "Put it back." Each word fell like a stone. "Tell me how you got them." Nita clutched the necklace tightly. "What kind of man are you?" Vernon's jaw tightened, a muscle working beneath the skin. For a moment, Tension crackled between them like summer lightning. Then, unexpectedly, his shoulders sagged slightly. "The kind you think I am," he said quietly. "What does that mean?" Vernon's gaze was direct, unflinching. "I was a bounty hunter, specialized in tracking down escaped Indians, runaway slaves, anyone with a price on their head. Best in the territory once upon a time." The revelation struck Nita like a physical blow. She took a step backward, clutching the doorframe for support. "You hunted people. My people." "Yes." The simple admission, devoid of excuse or justification, hung in the air between them. Nita's mind raced, connecting pieces of a puzzle. The tracking skills, the watchful eyes, the knowledge of the land, all suddenly taking on a sinister aspect. "Were you waiting for a reward? Is that why you helped me?" The thought made her stomach turn. "Are you going to return me to St. Catherine's after all?" "No." Vernon's voice was firm. "Those days are long behind me." "Then why keep these?" Nita gestured at the collection. "Trophies of your hunts." A flash of something, perhaps pain, crossed Vernon's features. "Reminders," he said cryptically. "Now put that back and leave the room. It's not for you." Their confrontation was interrupted by the distant sound of hoofbeats. Vernon's head snapped toward the window, his body instantly alert. He crossed the room in 2 quick strides, peering cautiously through the dusty glass. "Riders coming," he said, voice dropping to a near whisper. 3 men, one's wearing clerical clothes. Fear gripped Nita's heart. Bishop Walsh. No, but from St. Catherine's, most likely. Vernon turned to her, decision made. "There's a root cellar under the barn. Hidden trapdoor beneath the straw in the last stall. Go there now. No matter what you hear, stay quiet until I come for you." Nita hesitated, suddenly uncertain. This man had hunted her people, yet now he was helping her hide. "Why would you—" "No time." Vernon cut her off. "They'll be here in minutes. Go. Now." Something in his tone brooked no argument. Nita replaced the necklace and hurried out the back door, crossing the yard to the barn as quickly as she could, without running. Running would draw attention if the riders were close enough to see. In the barn, she found the trap door, where Vernon had described, concealed beneath a thick layer of straw. It opened to reveal a small earthen chamber just large enough for a person to sit hunched over. Nita climbed down, pulling the door closed above her, plunging herself into darkness. The sound of approaching horses grew louder, then stopped. Muffled voices, the creak of saddle leather as men dismounted. Then boots on the hard-packed earth of the yard moving toward the cabin. From her hiding place, Nita could hear little of what transpired. Occasional raised voices, but no words clear enough to understand. She hugged her knees to her chest, trying to control her breathing in the close confines of the cellar. Time stretched interminably. The darkness pressed in around her, reminiscent of the small closet at St. Catherine's, where students were confined for speaking their native languages. Nita forced the memory away, focusing instead on the small shaft of light that filtered through a crack in the trapdoor. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the sound of retreating hoofbeats reached her. Still, she remained hidden, remembering Vernon's instruction to wait for him. Nearly 30 minutes later, the trapdoor lifted, revealing Vernon's weathered face. "They're gone," he said simply, offering a hand to help her climb out. In the fading light of afternoon, they walked back to the cabin in silence. Only when they were inside, with the door firmly closed, did Nita speak. "Who were they?" Vernon moved to the window, checking once more to ensure the riders were truly gone. "Father Daniels from St. Catherine's and 2 men I didn't recognize, looking for a missing student." "What did you tell them?" "That I hadn't seen anyone." Vernon turned to face her. "Daniels wanted to search the property, I told him he was welcome to get a warrant. Nita's eyes widened. They'll come back with one. Maybe. Takes time, though. And the nearest judge who'd issue one is 3 days' ride away. Vernon poured 2 cups of water, offering one to Nita. By then, you could be long gone. Nita accepted the cup, studying Vernon over its rim. Why didn't you turn me in if you were a bounty hunter? Vernon emphasized. Not anymore. What changed? Vernon's gaze turned distant. Everything has its season. That life is behind me. But you still have the skills, Nita said slowly, an idea forming. You know how to track, how to avoid being tracked. You know the land. Vernon's eyes narrowed suspiciously. What are you getting at? Teach me, Nita said simply. Teach me to survive in this world, the white man's world. Vernon snorted. What makes you think I'd do that? Because you didn't turn me in. Because whatever your past, you chose to help me. Nita set down her cup, meeting his gaze directly. And because I have nowhere else to go, no one else to ask. For a long moment, Vernon stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then he turned away, busying himself with preparations for the evening meal. We'll see, he said finally, neither acceptance nor rejection. It was enough for now. The following dawn found Vernon and Nita riding away from the ranch, heading toward a secluded valley several miles distant. Vernon had decided that if Nita was to learn, it wouldn't be near the ranch where they might be observed. They rode in silence, Vernon leading on his chestnut mare, Nita following on a placid gray gelding. The early morning desert spread around them, painted in golds and reds by the rising sun. Despite the circumstances, Nita couldn't help but feel a surge of joy at being on horseback again, moving freely across the open land. Vernon chose a small box canyon for their destination, sheltered from view, with a stream providing water and rock faces that would contain the sound of gunfire. First lesson, Vernon said as they dismounted. In this world there's them that have guns, and them that die from guns. Which do you want to be? Without waiting for an answer, he removed a revolver from his saddlebag and held it out to Nita handle first. She hesitated only briefly before taking it, surprised by its weight. Colt Single Action Army, Vernon explained. 6 shots, reliable if you maintain it properly. For the next hour, he methodically taught her how to load, aim, and fire the weapon. His instruction was detailed and precise, devoid of unnecessary words or praise. When Nita missed the targets, he'd set up tin cans on a fallen log. He simply corrected her stance or grip and had her try again. By midday, Nita could hit the targets consistently at 10 paces. Her arms ached from the weight of the gun and the recoil, but a sense of satisfaction warmed her chest. Not bad, Vernon conceded, as they took a break to eat the simple lunch they'd brought. For a beginner. How do you know so much about Apache ways? Nita asked abruptly. The items in your cabin, they're authentic, sacred. Most white men wouldn't know their significance. Vernon continued, eating, eyes on the horizon. Spent time watching, learning, needed to understand the people I was tracking. That's all, Nita pressed. Vernon's jaw tightened. That's all you need to know. They ate the remainder of their meal in silence. As Vernon gathered the canteens to refill them at the stream, Nita noticed him watching her surreptitiously, his gaze lingering on the small wooden amulet that had worked its way out from beneath her shirt. What's that? He asked, nodding toward it. Nita instinctively reached to tuck it away, then hesitated. A fetish. My mother made it from manzanita wood before the soldiers came. She hesitated, then added, It's all I have left of her. Vernon nodded once, saying nothing more. But as they resumed their training that afternoon, moving from shooting to tracking techniques, Nita caught him looking at the amulet several times, an unreadable expression in his eyes. The sun was low in the sky when they finally returned to the ranch. As they approached, Vernon suddenly raised his hand in a signal to stop. He dismounted in one smooth motion, drawing his rifle from its saddle holster. "Someone's been here," he said quietly, indicating tracks in the dust that hadn't been there when they left. Heart pounding, Nita followed Vernon's lead, dismounting and moving cautiously toward the cabin. The tracks led directly to the front door, which stood slightly ajar. Vernon motioned for Nita to stay back, then moved silently to the side of the door, rifle ready. With practiced efficiency, he pushed the door open with the barrel of his gun and entered in a crouch, sweeping the room for threats. A moment later, he emerged. "Empty. They're gone." His expression was grim, but they searched the place thoroughly. Inside the cabin had been ransacked, drawers pulled out, bedding, overturned food supplies scattered. The padlocked door to the storage room had been broken open, its contents apparently examined, but left largely intact. "They were looking for you," Vernon said, righting a chair that had been knocked over. "Or evidence you were here." "Who?" Nita asked, helping to restore order to the chaos. "The men from St. Catherine's." Vernon shook his head. "Different tracks, heavier men, better boots." He knelt, examining a faint footprint on the floor. One had spurs, with a distinctive rowel, star-shaped, one point broken. The precision of his observation reminded Nita of his former profession. Despite her unease about his past, she couldn't help but be impressed by his skills. "Will they come back?" "Maybe." Vernon stood, moving to check that his rifle was fully loaded. "Hard to say what they wanted. If it was just to confirm you were here, they got their answer. If they want to take you back—" He left the sentence unfinished, but his meaning was clear. That night, neither of them slept much. Vernon took the first watch, sitting by the window with his rifle across his lap. Nita lay on her bed, ears straining for any unusual sound in the darkness. When it was her turn to watch, she found Vernon still awake, staring into the dying embers of the fire. "You should sleep," she said quietly. Vernon shook his head. "Been thinking." "About what?" He looked up, meeting her eyes. "Those men today. They weren't from St. Catherine's directly, but they're connected." "How do you know?" Vernon's expression grew distant. "Because I recognize the type of men. They're from a group called the Crusaders." "The Crusaders?" Nita repeated the unfamiliar word, awkward on her tongue. "Men who believe they have a holy mission to civilize the frontier. By any means necessary." Vernon's voice took on a hardness Nita hadn't heard before. "They work with the government, the churches, but they have their own agenda." A chill ran down Nita's spine. "And they're looking for me, looking for someone. Maybe you specifically, maybe any runaway." Vernon tossed another small log onto the fire. "Either way, this place isn't safe anymore, for either of us." "Where can we go?" Vernon seemed to consider the question carefully before answering. "I know someone in Tucson, a priest named Samuel Blackburn. He helps Indians, runaways, people in trouble. He might know somewhere safe for you." Nita's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "A priest? From another school like St. Catherine's?" "No." Vernon shook his head. "Samuel's different. He believes all that Christian charity should actually mean something." A hint of something like respect colored his tone. "He and we have history, but he might help for old times' sake." "You trust him?" Vernon's laugh was short and bitter. "I don't trust anyone, but Samuel's the closest thing to it." As the night wore on, they formed their plan. They would leave at first light, taking only what they could carry on horseback. Vernon knew back trails that would keep them away from the main roads where they might be spotted. "It's a 5-day ride to Tucson," he explained. "If we're careful, we can make it without being seen." As dawn approached, Nita stepped outside to perform a private ritual of prayer, a practice forbidden at St. Catherine's, but one she had maintained in secret. As she whispered the ancient words facing the rising sun, she became aware of Vernon watching from the doorway of the cabin. Instead of hiding her practice as she would have done at the school, Nita continued completing the prayer with a sense of defiance. Let him see. Let him know that despite everything, she remained Apache in her heart. When she finished, she turned to find Vernon still watching his expression, thoughtful rather than judgmental. "You pray to your spirits," he observed. It wasn't a question. "Yes." Nita lifted her chin slightly. "Will you report me to the bishop?" The corner of Vernon's mouth twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "Seems I'm not in any position to be reporting anyone to the bishop." He disappeared back into the cabin, returning a moment later with something in his hand, a small leather-bound Bible. "Different gods, perhaps," he said quietly, "or maybe the same one seen through different eyes." With that enigmatic statement, he turned away to continue preparations for their departure, leaving Nita to wonder about the complexity of the man who had once hunted her people, but now risked himself to help her escape. As the sun cleared the horizon, they mounted their horses and rode away from the ranch, leaving behind the briefly safe haven that had sheltered them. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and perhaps, though neither would have admitted it, a chance for each of them to find something they had lost long ago. For Nita, it was freedom and identity. For Vernon, something more elusive, perhaps redemption, or at least peace with the ghosts that haunted his sleepless nights. They rode side by side into the dawn, an unlikely pair bound by circumstance and necessity, each carrying their own burdens, their own hopes, their own secrets. The desert stretched before them, vast and unforgiving. But for the first time in years, Nita felt something stirring within her chest, not quite hope, but its distant cousin. A chance, a path forward, a possibility. It would have to be enough. The desert transformed with each passing hour. Morning's golden light gave way to the harsh white glare of midday, which softened into the amber hues of late afternoon. Vernon and Nita traveled mostly in silence, speaking only when necessary, each lost in private thoughts, as their horses maintained a steady pace across the unforgiving landscape. Vernon led them through arroyos and narrow canyons, avoiding the established trails where they might encounter other travelers. His knowledge of the land was impressive. Every water source, every sheltered spot for a camp, every vantage point from which to spot potential pursuit seemed etched into his memory. Occasionally, he would point out landmarks or signs that only a trained eye would notice, the subtle differences in vegetation that indicated water flowing beneath the surface, the distant spiral of dust that meant riders far ahead, the barely perceptible game trails used by desert creatures. "The land speaks," he told Nita during a brief rest in the shade of a sandstone outcropping. "Most people just don't know how to listen." By late afternoon of their first day, they'd covered nearly 20 miles, following a winding path that led them deeper into the territory's most desolate regions. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Vernon guided them into a narrow box canyon invisible from the surrounding terrain. "We'll camp here," he announced, dismounting with the careful movements of a man whose joints protested after long hours in the saddle. "Water for the horses, shelter from the wind, and only one way in or out." They established their camp with efficient movements, caring for the horses first, then gathering sparse desert wood for a small fire. Vernon prepared a simple meal of jerky beans and hardtack, while Nita collected water from a small spring that seeped from the canyon wall. As darkness settled around them, the temperature dropped rapidly, the day's heat fleeing into the vast desert night. The fire's warmth became a welcome necessity, rather than merely a convenience for cooking. Vernon sat cross-legged near the flames, a tin cup of coffee warming his weathered hands. Nita sat opposite him, the firelight casting dramatic shadows across her face. For a long while, they remained thus, the crackling of the fire and the occasional soft nickering of the horses, the only sounds disturbing the profound silence of the desert night. "Tomorrow we cross Chapman's Ridge," Vernon finally said, his voice startlingly loud after so much silence. "Rough terrain, but it keeps us away from the stage routes." Nita nodded, then hesitated before asking, "How do you know Father Samuel?" Vernon's eyes remained fixed on the flames, his expression unchanging. For so long did he remain silent that Nita thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost as if he were speaking to himself rather than to her. "We were young men together before the war between the states. Both of us came west afterward looking for something." He took a sip of coffee. "I found bounty hunting. Samuel found God." "And the Crusaders," Nita pressed. "Were you both part of them?" Vernon's jaw tightened. "Samuel never was. He saw them for what they were from the start." "And what were they?" Vernon's gaze finally lifted from the fire to meet hers, his blue eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "Men who twist faith into a weapon, who use the Bible to justify taking what they want." "Like St. Catherine's," Nita said softly, "taking children from their families, beating them for speaking their own language, all in the name of God." Vernon nodded once, a barely perceptible movement. "Bishop Luther Walsh is one of their leaders. The worst of them." The name sent an involuntary shiver through Nita. Luther Walsh, the imposing figure who presided over St. Catherine's with an iron hand and a Bible clutched to his chest. His voice thundered through the chapel during Sunday services, speaking of hellfire for the unrepentant and God's disappointment in those who clung to heathen ways. "How do you know so much about them?" she asked. Vernon set down his coffee cup, his movements deliberately slow. "Because I was one of them once." The admission hung in the air between them, weighted with unspoken implications. Nita felt her body tense, ready for flight, though there was nowhere to run in this isolated canyon. Vernon continued, his voice flat. "After the war, I was lost, angry. The Crusaders offered purpose, righteousness. Or so I thought. What happened? I saw what they really were, what I had become." His hand moved unconsciously to his chest, to a spot just below his left collarbone. "I left. They didn't take kindly to that." Nita's gaze followed the movement of his hand. "They marked you." Vernon's eyes narrowed slightly. "What makes you say that?" "I saw a scar when you were changing your shirt yesterday, a cross shape." Nita's voice took on a harder edge. "My people were marked too when they were captured. Brands, sometimes, to show ownership." Vernon's hand dropped away from his chest. "It's different, is it?" The challenge hung between them unanswered. After a long moment, Vernon stood moving to check on the horses. When he returned, he spread his bedroll on the opposite side of the fire from Nita. "Get some sleep," he said gruffly. "I'll take first watch." Nita knew he had evaded her question, but she didn't push further. The revelations of the evening had given her much to consider about the complicated man who was both her rescuer and perhaps part of the system that had destroyed her people. As she settled into her bedroll, Nita found herself wondering about the hidden depths of Vernon Holloway. What other secrets lay buried beneath his stoic exterior? What sins weighed on his soul during those sleepless nights when she heard him pacing the cabin floor? Sleep came slowly, accompanied by dreams of burning villages and men with crosses branded into their flesh, riding through the night in search of lost souls. Dawn broke with a chorus of desert birds greeting the new day. Vernon was already awake, brewing coffee over a rekindled fire. He acknowledged Nita with a nod, but offered no conversation, the previous night's revelations seeming to have widened the distance between them. They broke camp efficiently, and were riding within the hour, Vernon leading them up a steep trail that wound its way toward Chapman's Ridge. The path became increasingly treacherous, narrow ledges overlooking sheer drops, loose shale that threatened to give way beneath the horses' hooves, thorny vegetation that scratched at riders and mounts alike. By midday, they had reached the ridge's summit, a knife edge of stone offering spectacular views in all directions. Vernon halted, scanning the terrain with narrowed eyes. "No sign of pursuit," he murmured, more to himself than to Nita. "But that doesn't mean they're not looking." They continued along the ridge for several miles before beginning their descent, following a winding trail that led them down into a broad valley. The landscape here was subtly different, slightly greener, with scattered juniper and piñon pine offering welcome shade. As the afternoon wore on, Vernon grew increasingly alert, frequently checking their back trail. His hand often strayed to the rifle in its saddle holster, and his eyes constantly scanned the horizon. "What is it?" Nita finally asked. "Not sure." Vernon's voice was tense. "Something doesn't feel right." They rode in silence for another hour, Vernon's unease gradually infecting Nita. She found herself listening intently for any sound out of place, watching for any movement among the distant rocks and trees. The attack, when it came, was swift and unexpected. A rifle shot cracked through the still afternoon air. Vernon's horse screamed, rearing up, as blood bloomed on its shoulder. Before Nita could react, Vernon had flung himself from the saddle, dragging her down with him as more shots rang out. "Behind the rocks!" he shouted, pulling his rifle free and shoving Nita toward a cluster of boulders 20 yards away. They scrambled for cover as bullets kicked up dust around them. Reaching the relative safety of the rocks, Vernon positioned himself at the edge, rifle ready, peering cautiously toward the source of the gunfire. "2 shooters," he said tersely. "Maybe 3. Ridge to the east." Nita pressed herself against the stone heart, hammering in her chest. "Crusaders." "Maybe." Vernon's focus remained on the distant ridge, where occasional muzzle flashes betrayed their attackers' positions. "Or bounty hunters. Someone knows we're here." He fired 2 careful shots, then ducked back behind cover. "We need to move before they can flank us," he said, checking his ammunition. "There's a ravine about 50 yards south. If we can reach it, we can follow it to the river." Nita peered in the direction he indicated. The ravine seemed impossibly distant, with only scattered vegetation and a few small rocks to offer cover along the way. "We'll never make it," she said. Vernon met her eyes. "Not both of us together." He pressed his revolver into her hand. "I'll draw their fire. When they focus on me, you run for the ravine. Don't stop. Don't look back." "But you—" "I'll be right behind you." The lie was evident in his eyes, but his voice was steady. "Go on my signal." Before Nita could protest further, Vernon darted to the opposite edge of their rocky shelter and fired 3 rapid shots toward the ridge. Immediately, the attackers' attention shifted, a hail of bullets striking near Vernon's position. "Now!" he shouted, continuing to fire. Nita hesitated for only a moment before sprinting toward the ravine, expecting at any second to feel the impact of a bullet between her shoulder blades. The distance seemed to stretch endlessly, her legs moving as if through deep water despite her desperate speed. The sound of gunfire intensified behind her. Vernon, maintaining a steady rate of fire, forcing their attackers to keep their heads down. Then, just as she neared the ravine's edge, the character of the gunfight changed. A cry of pain reached her ears, followed by the distinctive sound of Vernon's rifle falling silent. Nita slid down into the ravine, landing hard on its sandy bottom. Instinct told her to continue running, to take the chance Vernon had given her at such cost. But something stronger than instinct kept her in place. She peered cautiously over the ravine's edge. Vernon lay partially exposed at the edge of the rock formation, one leg twisted at an unnatural angle, blood darkening the sand beneath him. He was alive, struggling to reach his fallen rifle as bullets struck around him. Without conscious thought, Nita raised the revolver Vernon had given her. The lessons of the past days came back with surprising clarity. Steady hand control, breathing, squeeze, don't pull. She aimed at the most visible of the attackers and fired. Her shot went wide, but it was enough to momentarily disrupt their attack on Vernon. Using that brief advantage, Nita fired twice more, forcing the attackers to take cover. In that moment of reprieve, Vernon dragged himself fully behind the rocks, out of the direct line of fire. His eyes found Nita's across the distance, a mixture of pain, anger, and grudging respect in their blue depths. For nearly an hour, a tense stalemate ensued. The attackers maintained their position on the ridge, but seemed unwilling to advance across open ground. Vernon, injured but alert, kept watch from behind the rocks. Nita remained in the ravine, conserving the revolver's few remaining bullets. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, a new sound reached them, hoofbeats approaching from the south. Vernon's face tightened with grim resignation. "More of them," he muttered, checking his rifle's chamber. Only 2 bullets remained. But as the riders came into view, it became clear they weren't additional attackers. An older man in a black cassock led the group of 5 horsemen, their approach purposeful but not aggressive. Upon seeing them, the attackers on the ridge fired a few more shots before retreating, disappearing over the far side. "Samuel!" Vernon breathed, a complex mixture of emotions coloring the name. The riders approached cautiously, the priest in the lead, raising a hand in a gesture of peace as they neared. He was in his late 60s, with thinning white hair and a kind face lined with the marks of age and desert sun. Despite his years, he sat his horse with the straight-backed confidence of a much younger man. "Vernon Holloway," he called as they drew near. "Still getting into trouble, I see." Vernon managed a pained grimace that might have been intended as a smile. "Better late than never, Samuel." Father Samuel Blackburn dismounted with surprising agility, approaching Vernon with obvious concern. "You're hurt. Broken leg, I think. Maybe a bullet graze." Vernon nodded toward the ravine. "The girl's over there. She's who they were after." Samuel signaled to his companions, and 2 of them moved toward the ravine, hands clearly visible to show they meant no harm. Nita emerged cautiously, the revolver still clutched in her hand. "It's all right," Vernon called to her. "This is Father Samuel, the one I told you about." Samuel approached Nita slowly, his expression gentle. "You must be the young Apache woman Vernon mentioned in his message." "Message?" Nita looked to Vernon in confusion. Vernon shrugged, wincing at the movement. "Sent a rider from the last settlement before we left. Wasn't sure you'd get it in time." Samuel smiled. "I was already on my way to your ranch. Heard rumors about Luther's men searching for a runaway." He turned back to Nita. "I'm Samuel Blackburn. I help people when I can, especially those fleeing places like St. Catherine's." "You're a priest," Nita said warily, not lowering the revolver. "I am," Samuel acknowledged. "But not all of us agree with Luther Walsh's methods. Some of us believe faith should heal, not harm." Something in his sincere tone persuaded Nita to lower the weapon, though she remained alert. Samuel's companions had meanwhile begun tending to Vernon, carefully splinting his injured leg. "We need to move," Samuel said, looking toward the ridge where their attackers had been. "They may return with reinforcements. There's an old mission about 5 miles from here where we can shelter for the night." With gentle efficiency, Samuel and his men helped Vernon onto a horse, securing his splinted leg to prevent further injury. Nita mounted behind one of the men, and their expanded group set off toward the mission, leaving behind the site of the ambush as twilight began to settle over the land. The mission turned out to be a small adobe structure nestled against a hillside partially concealed by a grove of ancient cottonwoods. Long abandoned by its original inhabitants, it had been repurposed by Samuel as a way station for those in need of sanctuary. Inside, the simple chapel had been converted to a living area with pallets for sleeping and a central fire pit vented through a hole in the roof. Side rooms served as storage for supplies and medicine. The entire place spoke of careful preparation for exactly this kind of emergency. As one of Samuel's men, a skilled healer trained during the war, Nita gathered, tended to Vernon's injuries, Samuel prepared a simple but nourishing meal. The atmosphere was one of cautious safety, a brief respite in what all knew was an ongoing danger. "Your leg is broken, but it's a clean break," the healer informed Vernon. "It will heal well if you stay off it." Vernon snorted. "Not much choice in that, is there?" With Vernon settled as comfortably as possible on a pallet near the fire, Samuel brought bowls of stew to both him and Nita. The priest sat cross-legged nearby, his movements revealing a surprising limberness for his age. "The men who attacked you were Luthers," Samuel said without preamble. "The Crusaders have been expanding their activities, taking more aggressive actions against those who oppose them." "Why would they care so much about one escaped student?" Nita asked, blowing on a spoonful of hot stew. Samuel and Vernon exchanged a glance, some unspoken communication passing between them. "It's more than that," Samuel said carefully. "Luther has been securing government contracts for more schools, more land. The Crusaders provide the muscle to ensure cooperation from the native populations. And to eliminate problems," Vernon added grimly, "like runaways who might tell tales about what really happens in those schools." Samuel nodded. "There's a federal investigation brewing. A judge in Tucson, Walter Montgomery, has been gathering evidence of abuses at St. Catherine's and similar institutions." "So I'm a loose end," Nita said flatly. "A witness they need to silence." "Yes," Samuel confirmed, "but also a symbol. If one student escapes and survives to tell their story, others might be inspired to resist as well." Vernon shifted uncomfortably on his pallet. "What's the plan, Samuel? The girl needs safe passage far from here. Oregon, maybe, or California." "First we get you both to Tucson," Samuel replied. "Judge Montgomery can provide protection while your leg heals. Then we'll determine the safest path forward." Nita looked between the two men, sensing undercurrents in their conversation that she didn't fully understand. "How do you two know each other? Vernon said you were young men together, but—" Samuel smiled slightly. "Vernon and I have known each other for over 40 years. We came west together after the war, looking for new beginnings." His expression sobered. "Our paths diverged when Vernon joined the Crusaders, and I opposed them." "Yet you're helping him now," Nita observed. "The past is complicated," Samuel said simply, "and Vernon has been trying to make amends in his way." Vernon scowled. "Don't paint me as some kind of Saint Samuel. I've done what needed doing, that's all." "Including helping an Apache girl escape from Luther," Samuel pointed out. "That's not nothing, Vernon." An uncomfortable silence fell. After a moment, Samuel rose. "You both need rest. We'll leave at dawn for Tucson. It's a 2-day ride if we push hard." As Samuel moved away to confer with his men, Nita turned to Vernon. "You didn't tell me you sent a message to him." Vernon shrugged. "Wasn't sure it would reach him in time. Didn't want to give false hope." "Why didn't they kill us?" Nita asked more quietly. "The attackers. They had the advantage." "They wanted you alive," Vernon replied grimly. "To make an example of. Public return to St. Catherine's, probably. Show everyone what happens to runaways." "And you?" Vernon's expression darkened. "I've been a thorn in Luther's side since I left the Crusaders. He'd have enjoyed making an example of me, too." Nita studied him thoughtfully. "What made you leave them, the Crusaders?" Vernon was silent for so long that Nita thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, meant for her ears alone. 12 years ago, we raided an Apache village near Black Mesa. Official orders were to relocate the people to a reservation, but Luther had other ideas." Nita went very still. Black Mesa. The name resonated through her like the strike of a hammer against a bell. Her village. The raid turned into a massacre. Vernon continued, his eyes fixed on the fire rather than on Nita. "Women, children, old men, Luther ordered no quarter. Said they were heathens resisting God's word." "And you followed those orders," Nita said, her voice barely audible. Vernon's jaw tightened. "Yes, until I saw a little girl hiding behind a bush. 8, maybe 9 years old, terrified. Luther ordered me to shoot her." Nita's heart pounded so loudly she was certain Vernon must hear it. "I aimed my rifle," Vernon said. "Our eyes met, and I couldn't do it. I fired into the air, pretended I'd killed her. Let her run." "What happened then?" "Luther suspected, had me watched. When he found out I'd let the girl escape, he branded me as a traitor to the cause and cast me out." Vernon's hand moved unconsciously to the cross-shaped scar on his chest. "I've been watching my back ever since." Nita's mind reeled with the implications of his story. The timing, the location, the details, they aligned too perfectly with her own memories to be coincidence. "This girl," she said carefully, "the one you spared. What did she look like?" Vernon finally turned to meet her gaze. Small for her age, long black hair, large eyes that seemed too old for her face. She wore a carved wooden amulet around her neck. Bear fetish, I think it was. Nita's hand moved to the amulet hidden beneath her shirt, the bear fetish her mother had carved for her, the one possession she'd managed to keep hidden through her years at St. Catherine's. "Like this one?" she asked, pulling it out for Vernon to see. Vernon's face drained of color, his eyes widening in recognition. "It can't be. I was there," Nita said, her voice steadier than she would have thought possible. "At Black Mesa, when the soldiers and the men with crosses came, when they burned our homes and shot my father, when my mother hid me behind a thicket of scrub oak and told me to run no matter what I heard." Vernon stared at her, shock evident in every line of his weathered face. "You're the girl, the one I let go. And you're the man who didn't shoot," Nita confirmed. "The one with the blue eyes who fired into the air instead of at me." The revelation hung between them, momentous and terrible. Vernon closed his eyes briefly, as if in pain beyond the physical. "All this time," he murmured. "All these years wondering if that girl survived, if my one moment of conscience meant anything at all." "I survived," Nita said, unsure whether the emotion rising in her was rage or something more complicated. "Only to be captured later and sent to St. Catherine's to have the Apache beaten out of me." Vernon opened his eyes, meeting her gaze directly. "I can't undo what was done to your people. To you. If you want to take that gun and finish what those attackers started, I wouldn't blame you." Nita's hand moved to the revolver at her side. It would be simple. Justice even for her family, her village, her people. Vernon watched her, making no move to defend himself, seemingly resigned to whatever judgment she might render. But the moment passed. Nita's hand fell away from the weapon. "I don't know what I want," she admitted. "But I know that killing you won't bring back my family or my home." "No," Vernon agreed quietly. "It won't." An understanding passed between them, not forgiveness, not yet perhaps, not ever, but an acknowledgement of the twisted thread of fate that had bound their lives together across the years. Across the room, Samuel watched their interaction with knowing eyes, though he could not have heard their quiet conversation. When Nita finally moved away to prepare her sleeping place, the priest approached Vernon. "You told her," he observed. Vernon nodded once. "She's the girl from Black Mesa, the one I let escape." Samuel's eyes widened slightly, the only indication of his surprise. "God works in mysterious ways, indeed." "Don't start with that," Vernon warned. "If there is a God, he's got a twisted sense of humor." Samuel smiled faintly. "Or perhaps a plan more complex than we can comprehend." He glanced toward Nita, who was unrolling her blanket near the wall. "What will you do now?" "Get her to safety," Vernon said without hesitation. "Beyond that, I don't know." "You could testify," Samuel suggested quietly. "Tell Judge Montgomery what you know about Luther, about the Crusaders. Your testimony could help bring down the whole organization." Vernon's expression hardened. "And go to prison myself. I wasn't just a witness, Samuel. I was part of it. Montgomery might arrange immunity in exchange for your testimony. And if he doesn't," Samuel placed a hand on Vernon's shoulder, "then at least you'll have done one last good thing. Set right some small portion of the wrong." Vernon had no answer to that. As Samuel moved away, Vernon's gaze drifted to Nita, now lying with her back to the room, her body language speaking eloquently of her desire for solitude. The fire burned low, casting long shadows across the mission's interior. Outside the desert, night had fallen vast and indifferent to the human dramas playing out beneath its star-filled expanse. Vernon stared into the embers, his mind filled with memories of a burning village, a frightened child, and paths not taken. Sleep, when it finally came, brought no peace, only dreams of accusatory eyes, and the distant sound of a harmonica playing a mournful tune that might have been a lament, or perhaps a prayer. Morning arrived with the hushed reverence peculiar to desert dawns. Inside the mission, preparations for departure were underway, before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. Samuel's men efficiently packed supplies, saddled horses, and made final checks of weapons. Vernon's broken leg had been splinted and bound securely, allowing him to ride with discomfort, but without causing further damage. He sat stiffly on his borrowed horse face, drawn with pain he refused to acknowledge. Nita moved around the edges of the activity, helping where she could, but maintaining a careful distance from Vernon. The revelations of the previous night had created a new barrier between them, one neither seemed ready to address in the clear light of day. Samuel approached her as she was filling canteens at the mission's well. "You're troubled," he observed gently. Nita secured the cap on a canteen before responding. "Wouldn't you be... The man who helped destroy my people is the same one who saved my life. Twice. The world seldom divides neatly into heroes and villains," Samuel replied. "Most of us live in the gray spaces between." "Is that supposed to comfort me?" Samuel shook his head. "No, just a truth I've learned in my years. Vernon has done terrible things. He's also done good, sometimes with the same hands. And I'm supposed to forgive him. Forgiveness is a gift you give yourself, not others, Samuel said. But it's not something anyone can demand of you, least of all me. He hesitated, then added, "What I will say is this. Vernon has been running from his past for 12 years. Perhaps meeting you is his opportunity to finally face it." Before Nita could respond, one of Samuel's men approached with urgent news. "Riders approaching from the north, father. At least 10 moving fast." Samuel's expression grew grave. "Luther's men. They must have tracked us here." He turned to the others. "Prepare to leave immediately. We'll take the canyon route." The peaceful morning erupted into focused activity. Supplies were hastily secured, weapons checked and loaded. Within minutes, they were mounted and moving away from the mission, following a narrow trail that led toward a rocky canyon barely visible in the distance. They rode hard, pushing their horses as much as they dared over the rough terrain. Vernon's face was a mask of pain, but he made no complaint, as each jolt sent fresh agony through his broken leg. The sound of pursuit grew steadily closer despite their efforts. Samuel led them into the canyon, where the trail narrowed further, barely wide enough for a single horse in some places. The towering walls offered protection from rifle fire, but also limited their options for escape. "There's a fork ahead," Samuel called back to the group. "The left path leads to higher ground, a defensible position. The right continues to Tucson, but through open country." A bullet struck the canyon wall nearby, showering them with stone fragments. Their pursuers had reached the canyon entrance. "We can't all make it," Vernon said grimly. "Not carrying a cripple." Samuel's expression was equally determined. "I won't leave you behind, old friend." "Don't be a fool," Vernon snapped. "I'll slow you down, get you all killed." They reached the fork in the trail, forced to make an immediate decision. Samuel hesitated only briefly before issuing orders. "Jacob Thomas, you'll accompany me and Vernon on the left path. We'll draw their fire, make a stand at the high ground." He turned to his other 2 men. "Michael David, take Nita and continue to Tucson. Get her to Judge Montgomery at all costs." "No," Nita protested. "I won't leave you to die for me." Vernon fixed her with a steely gaze. "This isn't about you, girl. It's about stopping Luther. You're a witness to what happens at St. Catherine's. Your testimony, combined with Montgomery's evidence, could bring the whole thing down." "Then come with us," Nita urged. "Your testimony would be even more valuable." "I can barely ride, let alone run," Vernon countered. "Someone needs to slow them down." Another bullet ricocheted off the canyon wall. Their pursuers were closing in. Samuel made the decision. "There's no time to argue. Michael David, go now. Get her to safety." The 2 men nodded grimly, turning their horses toward the right fork. One of them reached for Nita's reins. "Wait," she said, locking eyes with Vernon. "If you survive this, I'll be waiting in Tucson." A ghost of a smile touched Vernon's lips. "Don't count on it, girl. But I appreciate the thought." With that, they separated Nita and her 2 escorts, galloping down the right fork, while Samuel, Vernon, and the others took the left, heading for higher ground where they might make a stand. Nita glanced back once to see Vernon watching her, his expression unreadable at this distance. Then a bend in the canyon took him from view, and she was committed to her path, away from the man who had both destroyed and saved her life. They rode hard for hours, the sounds of gunfire from the left fork eventually fading behind them. The canyon opened onto a broad, arid plain that offered speed but little cover. Michael and David pushed their horses to the limit, constantly checking behind for signs of pursuit. By late afternoon, the distant spires of Tucson were visible on the horizon. The horses were lathered, and blowing hard, nearing exhaustion after the long, hard ride. "We'll have to slow down," Michael said reluctantly. "The horses won't make it otherwise." They reduced their pace to a walk, allowing the animals to recover somewhat. As they approached the outskirts of Tucson, David explained their plan. "Judge Montgomery has a home on the north side of town. We'll go directly there, avoiding the main streets where Luther might have men watching." Nita nodded, too exhausted for conversation. The events of the past days, the revelations, the dangers, the losses weighed on her like a physical burden. Her thoughts kept returning to Vernon and Samuel, wondering if they had survived the confrontation in the canyon. Tucson emerged from the desert like a mirage, made solid adobe buildings in warm earth tones, church steeples reaching toward the sky, the bustle of a frontier town where cultures collided and mingled. After so long in the empty desert, the sight of so many people was almost overwhelming to Nita. David led them through back streets and alleyways, avoiding the curious stares of townspeople. Eventually, they reached a large adobe home surrounded by a high wall. A heavy wooden gate barred the entrance. Michael dismounted and knocked a specific pattern. After a moment, the gate opened slightly, and a weathered face peered out. "We need to see Judge Montgomery," Michael said quietly. "Father Samuel sent us." The gate opened wider, revealing an elderly Mexican man who quickly ushered them inside, closing and barring the gate behind them. The courtyard beyond was cool and shaded with a small fountain bubbling at its center. "Wait here," the man said in accented English. "I will inform the judge." As they dismounted, Nita took in her surroundings. The house was substantial but not ostentatious, built in the traditional Spanish style around a central courtyard. Flowering plants softened the adobe walls, and the sound of the fountain created an atmosphere of tranquility, at odds with the danger that had pursued them. A door opened, and an imposing figure stepped into the courtyard. Judge Walter Montgomery was tall and lean, with a full white beard and penetrating dark eyes beneath bushy eyebrows. Despite his advanced age, Nita guessed him to be in his 70s. He carried himself with the straight-backed dignity of a much younger man. "Father Samuel's men," he observed, approaching them, but not Samuel himself. Michael explained their situation succinctly: the ambush, Vernon's injury, the separation at the canyon fork, and their flight to Tucson. Montgomery listened intently, his expression growing increasingly grave. When Michael finished, the judge turned his attention to Nita. "So you're the young woman who escaped from St. Catherine's," he said, his voice deep and resonant. "And you've brought trouble to my doorstep." Before Nita could respond, a woman's voice called from the doorway. "Walter, don't intimidate the poor girl. Can't you see she's exhausted?" Stella Montgomery was every bit as formidable as her husband, though in a different way. Where the judge projected authority, Stella exuded a warmth and practical compassion that immediately set Nita at ease. Her silver hair was arranged in a neat bun, and her clothing, though simple, was of fine quality. "Come inside, all of you," Stella insisted. "You need food and rest before any further discussions." The judge deferred to his wife with good grace, and soon they were seated around a large table in a cool dining room, being served a hearty meal by the household staff. Nita ate mechanically, her mind still processing the day's events, and her body beginning to feel the effects of days of hard travel and constant tension. "What will happen to Vernon and Father Samuel?" she asked when the edge had been taken off her hunger. Judge Montgomery's expression was carefully neutral. "If they survive the confrontation, they may yet make their way here. Samuel has faced difficult situations before. And if they didn't survive—" The judge exchanged a glance with his wife before answering. "Then we honor their sacrifice by continuing their work, by bringing Luther Walsh and his crusaders to justice." "How? Through the law," Montgomery said firmly. I've been gathering evidence for years, testimonies from former students, financial records showing misappropriation of government funds, documented cases of abuse. What I've lacked is a witness from within the Crusaders themselves. Vernon, Nita said softly. Montgomery nodded. His testimony would be invaluable, but even without it, your account of conditions at St. Catherine's would be powerful evidence. You want me to testify? The idea was simultaneously terrifying and appealing to Nita, to speak the truth about what she had endured to perhaps help prevent others from suffering the same fate. When the time comes, yes, Montgomery confirmed. But not yet. First, you need to rest and recover, and we need to ensure your safety. Luther won't give up easily, Michael warned. He'll have men searching Tucson by now. My home is secure, Montgomery assured him, and I have friends in the town who will report any suspicious activities. And as the meal concluded, Stella showed Nita to a small but comfortable bedroom. Rest now, she said kindly. You're safe here. Left alone, Nita sank onto the bed, emotions she had been holding at bay finally overwhelming her. The soft mattress, the clean sheets, the sense of temporary safety all served to release the tension that had sustained her through days of danger. Tears came unbidden for her lost family, for her lost people, for the complicated tangle of emotions she felt toward Vernon Holloway, hatred for his role in destroying her village, gratitude for his twice saving her life, confusion at the bond that seemed to have formed between them despite everything. As darkness fell over Tucson, Nita lay awake, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the town. Somewhere out in the desert, Vernon and Samuel might be fighting for their lives, or might already have lost that fight. The uncertainty was its own kind of torment. Eventually, exhaustion claimed her, and Nita drifted into uneasy sleep, her dreams filled with burning villages, dust storms, and a pair of haunted blue eyes watching her from a distant hillside. The next morning brought no news of Vernon and Samuel. Judge Montgomery left early to attend court, while Stella took charge of making Nita comfortable and explaining the situation more fully. Walter has been investigating the Crusaders for nearly 5 years, she told Nita, as they sat in a small garden behind the house. What began as an inquiry into conditions at the Indian schools expanded when he discovered the connection to the Crusaders and their broader activities. What exactly do they do? Nita asked. Beyond the schools, I mean. Stella's expression hardened. They've insinuated themselves into territorial politics, law enforcement business. They use the claim of civilizing the frontier to acquire land resources influence. The schools are just one part of it, a way to break the spirit of the native peoples while presenting a Christian facade to the government. And Vernon was part of this. Years ago, yes, Stella confirmed. Walter says Vernon was Luther's right hand for a time before something happened to turn them against each other. Black Mesa, Nita said quietly. The massacre of my village. Stella's eyes widened slightly. You know about that. I was there. I survived it. Nita held Stella's gaze. Vernon let me escape. It's why Luther branded him a traitor. Understanding dawned in Stella's eyes. So that's the connection between you two. Fate has a strange way of weaving lives together. It wasn't fate, Nita countered. It was men with guns and crosses deciding that my people didn't deserve to live on their own land. Stella inclined her head in acknowledgement. You're right, of course. I didn't mean to minimize the horror of what happened to your people. They sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the buzzing of bees among the flowering plants. What happens now? Nita finally asked. We wait, Stella replied, for news of Samuel and Vernon, for Walter to complete his preparations for the case against Luther, and we keep you safe. The day passed slowly. the waiting almost more difficult than the active danger of the previous days. Nita found herself pacing the courtyard, watching the gate for any sign of new arrivals starting at every unexpected sound. By evening, when Judge Montgomery returned from court, there was still no word. His expression was grim as he joined Nita and Stella for dinner. "Luther's men are in town," he reported without preamble, "making inquiries, watching the roads. They're being discreet, but my sources confirm at least 6 of them, possibly more." "Have they approached the house?" Stella asked, concern evident in her voice. "Not yet, but it's only a matter of time before they connect me to Samuel." Montgomery turned to Nita. "You'll need to remain inside, away from windows. We can't risk you being seen." Nita nodded, though the thought of confinement, even in this comfortable home, brought back uncomfortable memories of St. Catherine's. As they finished their meal, a soft knock at the door brought them all to attention. Montgomery motioned for Nita to move back out of sight, while he answered it himself, one hand resting near the revolver he wore even in his own home. A hushed conversation followed, too quiet for Nita to hear. When Montgomery returned to the dining room, his expression had changed from concern to cautious hope. "There's news," he announced. "A rider just arrived from the canyon. Samuel and his men managed to hold off Luther's pursuers long enough to escape. They're making their way to Tucson by a circuitous route." "And Vernon?" Nita asked, surprising herself with the intensity of her concern. Montgomery's expression sobered. "Alive, but his condition has worsened. The ride aggravated his injuries. They're moving slowly to accommodate him." "When will they arrive?" "Tomorrow, if all goes well. They're approaching from the west to avoid Luther's men watching the main roads." Relief flooded through Nita, though she was uncertain whether it was for Samuel or for Vernon. Perhaps both. The complexity of her feelings toward Vernon, the man who had participated in the destruction of her people but had also saved her life twice, continued to trouble her. That night, as Nita prepared for bed in the small room Stella had provided, she found herself drawn to the window. Pushing aside the curtain, she looked out at the star-filled desert sky, so vast and unchanging despite the turmoil of human lives beneath it. Somewhere out there, Vernon Holloway was making his way toward Tucson, injured and hunted. The man who had been present at the destruction of her childhood was now risking his life to help her reach safety. The contradiction seemed impossible to reconcile. As she turned away from the window, her hand moved unconsciously to the wooden amulet at her neck, the bear fetish her mother had given her, the one thing that connected her to her life before St. Catherine's, before the massacre. "Guide me," she whispered in Apache, the forbidden language feeling like a secret strength on her tongue. "Show me the path." But as before, the spirits offered no clear answer. This was a journey Nita would have to navigate by her own judgment, her own heart. Tomorrow, Vernon would arrive. Tomorrow, choices would need to be made. For tonight, at least, there was the small mercy of rest, of temporary safety. Nita lay down on the soft bed, her mind filled with images of burning villages and desert storms, of crosses and broken legs, of blue eyes that had both witnessed and averted death. Sleep came eventually, but it brought no resolution to the questions that troubled her waking thoughts. The past and present remained tangled like tracks crossing in the desert sand, leading to an uncertain future. Dawn broke over Tucson with the gentle inevitability of all desert mornings. The sky shifted from deepest indigo to pale lavender, then erupted in a blaze of gold and crimson as the sun crested the eastern mountains. In this early hour, the town remained quiet, only a few early risers moving through the streets, shopkeepers preparing for the day, laborers heading to work, the occasional night watchman returning home after his shift. At Judge Montgomery's house, Nita stood on a small balcony outside her room, watching the sunrise with a mixture of wonder and apprehension. After years confined at St. Catherine's, where students were awakened by bells and prayer rather than natural rhythms, the simple beauty of dawn still felt like a forbidden luxury. The sound of horses approaching drew her attention to the street below. She instinctively stepped back, moving into the shadow of the doorway where she could observe without being seen. A group of riders passed slowly, their attention focused on the houses they passed. Even from her hidden vantage point, Nita recognized their purpose, Luther's men searching. One rider in particular caught her eye, a tall man with a neatly trimmed beard wearing a black coat despite the growing heat of the day. Though she had only glimpsed him briefly at St. Catherine's, Nita recognized Bishop Luther Walsh immediately. His stern profile, so often depicted in the portraits hanging in the school's corridors, was unmistakable. Nita's heart quickened. Luther himself had come to Tucson. This was no longer simply about recapturing a runaway student. This had become a personal mission for the Crusaders' leader. A soft knock at her door startled her. "Nita," Stella Montgomery's voice called quietly. "Are you awake?" Nita moved quickly from the balcony, closing the door behind her. "Yes, I'm here." Stella entered, her silver hair already neatly arranged despite the early hour. Her expression a careful balance of concern and encouragement. "Walter wishes to speak with you. There's been news." Following Stella downstairs, Nita found Judge Montgomery in his study, a room lined with books and legal papers. Despite the early hour, he was fully dressed in a suit that, while well worn at the edges, conveyed the dignity of his position. His face showed signs of a sleepless night, deeper lines around his eyes, a certain weariness in his posture. "Miss Nita," he greeted her formally. "I hope you rested well." "Well enough," she answered. "You have news of Father Samuel and Vernon." Montgomery nodded, gesturing for her to sit. "A messenger arrived before dawn. They're at a safe house just outside town. They'll attempt to reach us after nightfall." "Are they all right?" The judge hesitated. "Samuel is unharmed, but Vernon's condition has deteriorated. The continued travel with his injury has led to fever. Samuel fears infection in the wound." Nita absorbed this news silently. The complicated tangle of emotions she felt toward Vernon Holloway, hatred, gratitude, understanding, confusion, did not prevent a surge of concern at this information. "There's more," Montgomery continued. "Luther Walsh is in Tucson personally." "I saw him," Nita confirmed, "from my balcony. He passed by with several men." Montgomery's bushy eyebrows rose in surprise. "You should avoid the balcony hereafter. It's too exposed." "Why has he come himself?" Nita asked. "Surely he doesn't personally pursue every runaway from St. Catherine's." "No," Montgomery agreed grimly. "His presence confirms what we suspected. This is about more than just your escape. Luther knows that I've been building a case against him and the Crusaders. Your testimony, combined with Vernon's, could provide the evidence needed to bring formal charges." "Charges of what? Murder, fraud, misappropriation of federal funds, abuse." Montgomery ticked off the items with grim satisfaction. "Enough to dismantle the Crusaders entirely and send Luther to prison for the remainder of his life." Stella, who had been quietly arranging breakfast on a small side table, joined the conversation. "Luther won't allow that without a fight. He has too much to lose. Which is why security must be our priority," Montgomery said firmly. "Nita will remain inside today. No one enters or leaves the house without my explicit permission." The gravity of the situation settled over the room. Nita found herself wondering if her freedom, her life, was worth the risk to these people who barely knew her. The thought of Vernon struggling with fever, of Samuel risking his life, of the Montgomerys opening their home to danger, all for her sake, was overwhelming. "Perhaps I should leave," she suggested. "Draw them away from here." "Absolutely not," Montgomery responded immediately. That's precisely what Luther wants to isolate you, capture you, silence you. Here you have protection and support. But the danger to all of you is a risk we've chosen, Stella interrupted gently. Walter and I have been fighting against men like Luther for decades. This isn't the first time our home has sheltered those in need of protection. Montgomery nodded in agreement. The fight against injustice always carries risk, Miss Nita. But it's a risk worth taking. Something in their calm conviction silenced Nita's protests. These were not naive idealists, but seasoned fighters who understood exactly what they faced and had made their choice with clear eyes. The day passed with excruciating slowness. Nita remained inside as instructed, though the confinement chafed after days of open desert. To occupy herself, she helped Stella with household tasks, finding comfort in the simple routine of folding linens and preparing vegetables for the evening meal. As they worked side by side in the kitchen, Stella shared stories of her life with the judge, their early years in Boston, their decision to move west after the war, their gradual involvement in causes related to the fair treatment of native peoples. Walter wasn't always so passionate about these matters, Stella admitted. When we first came west, he was primarily concerned with establishing his legal practice. But then he witnessed a trial where an Apache man was convicted of murder without a single word of testimony being translated for him to understand. What happened? Walter appealed the case all the way to territorial authorities. When that failed, he sought a federal review. Stella's hands continued their work shaping dough with practiced movements. It took 3 years, but he eventually secured the man's release. That changed him. It opened his eyes to the systemic injustices facing the native peoples. And once Walter sees an injustice, he cannot rest until he's addressed it. Nita considered this as she sliced carrots for the stew. And you? What brought you to this cause? A small smile curved Stella's lips. I was raised in a Quaker household in Pennsylvania. My parents taught me from childhood that all humans are equal in the eyes of God. When I saw how the native peoples were being treated here, she shook her head. It offended my sense of justice, my faith, everything I believed in. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of the front door opening and closing. Judge Montgomery's voice called out, followed by another unfamiliar voice. Stella wiped her hands on her apron, gesturing for Nita to stay in the kitchen as she went to investigate. When she returned moments later, her expression was troubled. Luther has called an emergency town meeting at the courthouse. He's making a public appeal for help in locating a dangerous Apache fugitive and her criminal accomplices. He's turning the town against us, Nita realized. Stella nodded grimly. Walter has gone to attend the meeting. He feels his absence would be noted and raise suspicion. What does this mean for Father Samuel and Vernon? How will they reach us now? Walter will warn them through our messenger. They may need to delay their arrival until things calm down. Stella sighed. And Vernon's condition makes waiting dangerous. As evening approached, the atmosphere in the house grew increasingly tense. Judge Montgomery had not yet returned from the town meeting, and without news, Stella and Nita could only wait and wonder what was transpiring beyond their walls. Night had fully fallen when they finally heard the distinctive pattern of knocks at the rear entrance. Stella hurried to answer, returning moments later with a grim-faced Montgomery. "It's worse than I feared," he announced without preamble. "Luther has whipped half the town into a frenzy, with tales of Apache raids and white children in danger. He's offered a substantial reward for information leading to your capture." "What about Vernon and Father Samuel?" Nita asked. "I've sent word to delay their arrival, but—" Montgomery was interrupted by another knock, this one at the front gate. His hand moved instinctively to his revolver. "Stella, take Nita to the cellar. Now." Stella led Nita swiftly through the kitchen to a trapdoor concealed beneath a large rug. The space below was small but clean, with supplies suggesting it had been prepared for exactly this purpose. "Stay here," Stella whispered. "Whatever you hear, don't come out until one of us calls for you." Alone in the darkness, Nita strained to hear what was happening above. Muffled voices reached her Montgomery's deep tones, another man's higher, more insistent voice. The conversation seemed to grow more heated, then abruptly fell silent. Minutes stretched interminably. Nita's muscles tensed with each creak of the floorboards overhead, each distant sound that might indicate trouble. Her hand found the small bear fetish at her neck, fingers tracing its familiar contours as she whispered a silent prayer in Apache. Finally, the trapdoor opened, revealing Montgomery's face, lined with new worry. "It's clear for now," he said, helping her up. "That was the sheriff. Luther has convinced him to organize a house-by-house search of the town. When? It begins tomorrow at dawn." Montgomery's expression was grim but determined. "We need to move you somewhere else, somewhere they won't think to look." "But where?" Stella asked. "Luther's men are watching the roads." "The mission," Montgomery decided. "Father Domingo's place on the edge of town. The church might offer sanctuary, and Luther would hesitate to violate it openly." As they discussed details of the plan, another knock came at the rear door, this time a rapid, urgent pattern. Montgomery drew his revolver again, moving cautiously to answer. The voices at the door were too low for Nita to distinguish words, but the urgency was clear. A moment later, Montgomery returned, his expression a mixture of relief and concern. "Samuel is here," he announced. "With Vernon. They couldn't wait. Vernon's condition has worsened." Nita followed Montgomery and Stella to the small courtyard at the rear of the house. In the dim light of a covered lantern, she saw Father Samuel supporting a barely conscious Vernon. The older man's face was haggard with exhaustion, his normally neat appearance disheveled from days of hard travel and danger. Vernon looked far worse. His face was flushed with fever, his breathing labored. The splint on his leg showed signs of bloody seepage around the edges. "He needs a doctor," Samuel said without preamble. "The wound is infected." "A doctor would report his presence to the sheriff," Montgomery said grimly. "Bring him inside. Stella knows something of medicine." They carried Vernon to a small room off the kitchen, laying him on a narrow bed. As Stella began examining the wound, Nita stood in the doorway, watching Vernon's face contort with pain, despite his semi-conscious state. "How did you get through the town without being seen?" Montgomery asked Samuel. "God's grace and good timing," the priest replied wearily. "We came in through the old creek bed behind the tannery. One of your messengers guided us." Stella looked up from her examination, her expression grave. "The infection is severe. I can clean and redress the wound, but he needs medicines I don't have." "I know what plants can help," Nita said suddenly. All eyes turned to her. "At St. Catherine's, they tried to make us forget our ways, but my grandmother was a healer. She taught me which desert plants fight fever and infection." "You'd need to gather them," Samuel pointed out. "That means leaving the house, exposing yourself to capture." "I'll go," Nita said firmly. "Tell me where to find the plants and I'll bring them back," Montgomery countered. Nita shook her head. "You wouldn't know what to look for. The wrong plant could kill rather than cure." She looked at Vernon's suffering face. "He saved my life. Twice. I can do this much." An unspoken communication passed between Montgomery and Stella, a married couple's ability to convey thoughts without words. Finally, Montgomery nodded reluctantly. Samuel will accompany you, he decided. You'll go tonight under cover of darkness. The sheriff's search doesn't begin until morning. Plans were made quickly. Nita described the plants she needed. Some might be found in the desert just beyond town. Others could potentially be purchased from the Mexican market if any stalls were still open at this late hour. Samuel, despite his exhaustion, agreed to the mission. I know the market well, he said. The vendors trust me. As Nita prepared to leave, gathering a small sack for the plants and a knife for harvesting, she found herself alone with Vernon for a moment. Stella had gone to fetch clean water, leaving Nita to watch over the feverish man. Vernon's eyes fluttered open, focusing on her with difficulty. Nita. He rasped, his voice barely audible. You're safe. Yes, she confirmed, moving closer to the bed. We're in Tucson at Judge Montgomery's house. Vernon's hand moved weakly, reaching for hers. After a moment's hesitation, Nita allowed him to take it. His skin burned with fever. I'm sorry, he whispered. For everything. For Black Mesa. For your family. Nita felt tears prick her eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. I know, she said softly. If I die, you won't die, Nita interrupted firmly. I'm going to find medicines, plants my grandmother taught me about. They'll help fight the infection. A ghost of a smile touched Vernon's cracked lips. Still believing in your old ways. Some old ways have wisdom the new cannot match, Nita replied. Vernon's eyes drifted closed again, his hand going slack in hers. Nita gently placed it back on the bed, then turned to find Samuel watching from the doorway, his expression thoughtful. Ready? He asked softly. Nita nodded, pushing aside the complex emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. Now was not the time for sorting through feelings of hatred, forgiveness, or anything in between. Now was the time for action. They slipped out into the night, two shadows moving through the darkened streets of Tucson. Samuel led the way, his knowledge of the town's back alleys and hidden paths proving invaluable. They avoided the main thoroughfares where Luther's men might be watching, instead navigating a labyrinth of narrow passages between adobe buildings. The Mexican market was mostly closed at this hour, but a few vendors still lingered, packing away their unsold goods by lantern light. Samuel approached them in fluent Spanish, his clerical collar granting him respect even at this unusual hour. With his help, Nita acquired several of the herbs she needed, not the exact varieties her grandmother would have used, but close enough to serve the purpose. For the remaining plants, they needed to venture beyond the town's edge into the desert. Here, the risk increased significantly. Open ground meant greater visibility, and Luther's men were surely watching the outskirts of town. Moving with painstaking care from shadow to shadow, they reached the desert beyond the last buildings. Nita scanned the ground in the dim starlight, searching for the distinctive shapes of the plants she needed. Samuel kept watch, his attention constantly moving across the horizon for any sign of danger. There, Nita whispered, pointing to a small, scraggly bush with silver-green leaves. That one fights fever. She knelt, using her knife to carefully harvest just what was needed, murmuring a traditional Apache prayer of thanks to the plant for its sacrifice. As she worked, Samuel kept a respectful distance, understanding the spiritual significance of her actions without need for explanation. They had collected 3 of the 4 plants Nita sought, when a distant light caught Samuel's attention. "Someone's coming," he warned quietly. Nita looked up to see lanterns moving along the road that led into town. Riders, at least 4 of them, approaching slowly as if searching for something or someone. "Luther's men," Samuel whispered. "We need to move." They retreated further from the road, deeper into the desert, where darkness offered some protection. The last plant Nita needed grew primarily near water sources, a challenge in the desert, but not impossible. "There's a small stream about half a mile east," Samuel said. "It might grow there." They moved as quickly as they dared, acutely aware of the riders behind them. The stream, when they reached it, was little more than a trickle between rocks, but the moisture was enough to support a different range of vegetation. In the dim starlight, Nita searched desperately for the distinctive red-stemmed plant her grandmother had called firebark. There, she finally spotted it, growing between two rocks. As she bent to harvest it, voices carried to them on the night air the riders had changed direction, moving toward the stream. "They know this water source," Samuel realized. "They're checking all the likely places someone might hide." Anita worked quickly, cutting several pieces of the plant's bark and stem. "I have what we need. Let's go." But it was too late for a clean escape. As they turned to retreat, a lantern light swept across the area, briefly illuminating them before they could duck behind a large boulder. "Someone's there!" a man's voice called out. The sound of horses moving their direction followed immediately. "Run!" Samuel urged Nita. "I'll draw them off. I won't leave you." "This isn't about me," Samuel cut her off. "It's about getting those medicines to Vernon and your testimony to Judge Montgomery. Go, now." Before Nita could protest further, Samuel stepped out from behind the boulder, making himself visible to the approaching riders. "Good evening, gentlemen," his voice carried clearly in the night air. "A fine night for a ride, is it not?" Nita used the distraction to slip away in the opposite direction, clutching her precious cargo of medicinal plants. Behind her, she heard the riders confronting Samuel, their voices raised in question and accusation. She forced herself to keep moving, even as guilt gnawed at her for leaving the kind priest to face Luther's men alone. The town loomed ahead, its few remaining lights guiding her back toward safety. Using all the stealth skills Vernon had taught her during their brief time together, Nita made her way through back alleys and shadows, avoiding the occasional night watchman or late reveler. When she finally reached Montgomery's house, she used the special knock they had arranged. The door opened almost immediately, revealing the judge's concerned face. "Thank God," he breathed, ushering her inside. "Where's Samuel?" "Luther's men found us near the stream," Nita explained breathlessly. "He stayed behind to draw them off, so I could escape with the plants." Montgomery's expression darkened with worry, but he nodded in understanding. "Samuel has friends in town. If he's arrested, we'll know soon enough." In the kitchen, Stella had prepared for their return with clean water boiling on the stove and fresh bandages laid out. Nita quickly showed her how to prepare the medicinal plants, which to boil into teas, which to grind into poultices for the wound. Working together, they created the healing preparations Nita's grandmother had taught her. The familiar smells, earthy, pungent, medicinal, brought memories flooding back of sitting at her grandmother's side learning the ancient knowledge of her people. Knowledge that St. Catherine's had tried to erase from her mind, dismissing it as primitive superstition. Vernon's condition had deteriorated further in their absence. His skin burned with fever, and his breathing had become shallow and rapid. When they removed the bandages from his leg, the wound beneath was red and inflamed with angry streaks extending outward, blood poisoning already spreading through his system. "Will your medicines be enough?" Stella asked quietly as they worked. Nita hesitated. "I don't know. The infection is severe, but they're his best chance." They worked through the night, applying the poultices to draw out infection-spooning sips of medicinal tea between Vernon's cracked lips, when he was conscious enough to swallow. Nita never left his side, using cool cloths to bring down his fever, speaking softly to him in Apache when his delirious mind seemed lost in nightmares of the past. Dawn was breaking when Judge Montgomery entered the room, his face grave with new concern. "Samuel has been arrested," he announced quietly. "The sheriff is holding him for questioning about aiding fugitives." Nita's heart sank. "This is my fault." "No," Montgomery countered firmly. "Samuel made his choice. He's made the same choice countless times before to stand for what's right, despite the personal cost. What will happen to him?" "For now, nothing serious. The sheriff respects Samuel even if he's been swayed by Luther's influence, but it complicates matters." Montgomery ran a hand through his already disheveled hair. "The house-to-house searches begin in a few hours. We need to move both of you." "Vernon can't be moved," Stella objected, gesturing to the unconscious man. "The journey could kill him." "Staying here could kill all of us," Montgomery replied grimly. "Luther knows Samuel was helping someone. It won't take him long to connect the dots to us." A tense silence fell over the room as they confronted the impossible situation. To stay meant almost certain discovery. To leave meant potentially sacrificing Vernon's life. The decision was taken from their hands by a frantic knocking at the rear door, not the arranged pattern, but rapid, desperate strikes. Montgomery drew his revolver, moving cautiously to answer. He returned moments later with one of his trusted contacts, a young Mexican man named Miguel, who worked at the courthouse. The young man's face was flushed with exertion and fear. "They're coming, Judge," he gasped out. "Luther convinced the sheriff to search your house first. They're gathering men now. They'll be here within the hour." The news galvanized them into action. While Stella and Nita prepared Vernon for transport as best they could, Montgomery and Miguel quickly gathered essential supplies and documents. "Where will we go?" Nita asked, as she carefully wrapped fresh bandages around Vernon's leg. "The mission, as we discussed before," Montgomery replied. "Father Domingo will grant sanctuary. But we must hurry." They fashioned a makeshift stretcher for Vernon from a blanket and 2 sturdy poles. When all was ready, they carried him through the house to a small door in the garden wall, normally used by servants bringing deliveries. The morning light was still dim, the streets relatively empty as they made their careful way through back alleys toward the mission on the town's edge. Montgomery led the way, revolver in hand, while Miguel brought up the rear, watching for pursuit. Nita and Stella walked beside Vernon's stretcher, monitoring his condition. The mission of San Xavier appeared before them, its white walls gleaming in the early morning sun. The simple adobe structure, topped by a modest bell tower, seemed to offer a promise of sanctuary. As they approached, the massive wooden doors opened, revealing a stooped but dignified figure in the robes of a Franciscan monk. Father Domingo greeted them with calm efficiency, showing no surprise at their unusual arrival. "Bring him inside," he directed, leading them to a small side room equipped with a narrow bed. "The sheriff will not violate the sanctity of the church without serious cause." "Luther Walsh might," Montgomery warned as they carefully transferred Vernon to the bed. Father Domingo's weathered face hardened. "Bishop Walsh and I have our differences regarding the interpretation of Christian charity. He knows better than to overstep his bounds here." With Vernon settled, Father Domingo offered them a simple breakfast of bread, cheese, and coffee. As they ate, Montgomery explained the full situation: Nita's escape from St. Catherine's, Vernon's role in both her people's destruction and her recent salvation, Luther's pursuit, and the evidence they hoped to present against the Crusaders. The old priest listened without interruption, his expression thoughtful. When Montgomery finished, Father Domingo nodded slowly. "I have heard rumors of Walsh's Crusaders for years," he said. "Their interpretation of our faith to justify violence and theft of native lands is an abomination." "Will you help us?" Nita asked directly. Father Domingo met her gaze. "The church has much to answer for in its treatment of your people, young woman. I cannot undo those wrongs, but I can offer sanctuary while you seek justice." He turned to Montgomery. "What is your plan?" "Federal authorities arrive in 3 days for the quarterly court session," Montgomery explained. "With their presence, I can present the evidence formally beyond Luther's local influence. But we must keep Nita and Vernon safe until then. "And Father Samuel?" Stella asked. Montgomery's expression grew troubled. "I'll do what I can legally to secure his release, but it may be better for him to remain in custody for now, where Luther can see him and believe he's neutralized the threat." As they discussed details, a quiet moan from Vernon drew Nita to his side. His eyes flickered open clearer than they had been since his arrival in Tucson. "Where?" he rasped, his voice barely audible. "A mission," Nita explained softly. "We're safe for now." Vernon's gaze focused on her face with effort. "Samuel. Arrested, but alive and well." Vernon closed his eyes briefly, pain etched in the lines of his face. "This is my fault. All of it." "Rest," Nita urged. "Save your strength." But Vernon's eyes opened again, intense, despite his weakness. "Listen to me. If I don't survive this—" "You will survive," Nita interrupted. "The medicines are working. Your fever has broken." "If I don't," Vernon insisted, "you need to know everything. About Black Mesa, about Luther, about why he wants you silenced so badly." Nita glanced toward the others still deep in conversation across the room. Turning back to Vernon, she nodded. "Tell me." Vernon's voice was weak but determined. "Black Mesa wasn't just any Apache village. Luther knew exactly what he was doing when he targeted it." "What do you mean?" "There was gold," Vernon explained. "Not much, but enough to interest the Crusaders. And something more valuable: water rights. Control of Black Mesa meant control of the watershed for the entire region." Nita frowned. "But the government was already forcing Apache people onto reservations. Why the massacre?" "Your village was different. It had a treaty, a legal document from decades earlier, that recognized Apache sovereignty over that land." Vernon's breathing grew labored with the effort of speaking, but he continued. "Luther needed the village gone, and the treaty forgotten. A massacre blamed on Apache aggression solved both problems." The revelation struck Nita like a physical blow. Her people had been killed not just out of prejudice or religious zealotry, but for profit, for gold and water and land. "How do you know this?" she asked. "Because I saw the treaty," Vernon replied. "Luther showed it to me before we burned the village headman's dwelling, said it was the real target of our raid." His hand weakly reached for hers. "I didn't understand then, but I do now. And that's why he wants me dead, because I might remember the treaty." Vernon shook his head slightly. "You were a child, but he fears what I might know, what I might testify to. And now that you and I are connected, his fear has doubled." A bitter smile touched his lips. "The great Bishop Luther Walsh, afraid of a broken-down bounty hunter and an Apache girl." The effort of speaking had clearly exhausted Vernon. His eyes drifted closed again, his breathing evening out as he slipped back into sleep, but natural sleep now, not the fevered unconsciousness of before. Nita sat beside him, absorbing the implications of what he had revealed. A treaty, legal rights to the land, evidence that could potentially overturn decades of injustice. If they could find it, if it still existed. She was still deep in thought when Montgomery approached. "How is he?" the judge asked quietly. "Better," Nita replied. "The fever has broken, and he was lucid enough to speak." "What did he say?" Nita hesitated, then shared Vernon's revelation about the treaty and Luther's true motives for the Black Mesa massacre. Montgomery listened with growing interest, his legal mind clearly assessing the implications. "If such a treaty exists, and we could find it," he mused, "it would strengthen our case against Luther enormously. It would elevate this from individual crimes to a conspiracy against an entire people. But after 12 years, would it still exist? Government documents are filed in multiple places, Montgomery explained. If Luther destroyed one copy, others might remain in territorial archives or in Washington. Or Luther might still have it, Nita suggested, as insurance or proof of his claim to the land. Montgomery nodded thoughtfully. Possible. The question is how to find it. Their conversation was interrupted by Father Domingo, who entered the room with an air of urgent concern. "Riders approaching," he announced. "Several men, including Bishop Walsh and the sheriff." Montgomery's expression hardened. "So much for respecting church sanctuary." He turned to Stella. "Take Nita and Vernon to the root cellar. Father Domingo showed us earlier." "And you?" Stella asked, though she was already moving to help Nita with Vernon. "I'll speak with them," Montgomery replied grimly. "I am still a federal judge. They cannot simply ignore the law." Working quickly but carefully, they moved Vernon from the bed to the root cellar, a cool earthen chamber beneath the mission kitchen, accessed through a trapdoor hidden under a heavy rug. The space was cramped but clean, with shelves of preserved foods lining the walls, and several blankets folded in one corner. They had barely closed the trap door when they heard the mission's main doors open and voices echo through the building, Montgomery's measured tones contrasting with another man's more strident demands. From their hiding place, they could hear only fragments of the conversation above, but the tension was evident even through the muffled voices. The discussion grew heated, then seemed to move further away, perhaps into another part of the mission. Minutes stretched interminably. Vernon stirred on his makeshift bed, his eyes opening to find Nita watching him anxiously. "Luther," he whispered. Nita nodded. "With the sheriff. Judge Montgomery is speaking with them." Vernon's expression grew troubled. "Montgomery can't hold them off forever. Not if Luther's desperate." "We only need to survive 3 more days," Nita reminded him. "Then the federal authorities arrive." 3 days is a lifetime when you're hunted, Vernon replied grimly. They fell silent as footsteps passed overhead, moving methodically through the mission. The search had begun despite Montgomery's protests and Father Domingo's invocation of sanctuary. Stella pressed her finger to her lips, signaling for absolute silence. Vernon, despite his weakened condition, managed to position himself so that he could reach the revolver Montgomery had left with them. Nita held her breath as the footsteps paused directly above their hiding place. The rug shifted slightly as someone walked over it. Dust filtered down through the cracks in the trapdoor. For a heart-stopping moment, Nita thought they had been discovered. But then the footsteps moved on, continuing their search elsewhere in the building. When the sounds finally faded, Stella risked whispering, "They've moved to another part of the mission." "They'll be back," Vernon predicted softly. "Luther won't give up easily." As if to confirm his words, they soon heard multiple sets of footsteps returning to the kitchen area. This time they could clearly distinguish voices, Montgomery's, the sheriff's, and a third that made Nita's blood run cold. "I respect the church's traditions, Father Domingo, but this is a matter of public safety." Bishop Luther Walsh's voice carried even through the floor, smooth and authoritative. "A dangerous fugitive and her accomplice are believed to be in Tucson. We have a duty to search thoroughly." "You have searched, Bishop," Father Domingo's reply was equally firm, "and found nothing. I must insist you respect the sanctity of this mission." "Perhaps a more thorough examination of the kitchen," Luther suggested. "These old missions often have storage cellars, do they not?" Nita's heart raced. Vernon's hand tightened on the revolver, his expression grim but determined. Stella reached out to clasp Nita's hand, offering silent support. "Bishop Walsh," Montgomery's voice cut through the tension. "I believe we've imposed on Father Domingo's hospitality long enough. The mission has been searched, and your fugitives are clearly not here." "But Judge Montgomery," Luther's tone was silky, with barely concealed menace, "your interest in this matter is most curious. One might almost suspect you of harboring sympathies for these fugitives." "I harbor sympathies for due process and the rule of law," Montgomery replied evenly, "neither of which seems to concern you overmuch." A tense silence followed this exchange. Then the sheriff's voice, uncomfortable but firm. "I think we're done here, Bishop. Judge Montgomery is right. We've searched and found nothing." Luther's response was too quiet to hear clearly, but the tone conveyed his displeasure. Footsteps moved away, and eventually the distant sound of the mission's main doors closing signaled the searchers' departure. Still, they waited tense and silent for what felt like an eternity before the trapdoor finally opened to reveal Montgomery's face lined with new worry. "They're gone for now," he reported, helping Stella up from the cellar. But Luther is not convinced. He'll be watching the mission. With Stella and Montgomery's help, Nita managed to get Vernon back to his bed in the side room. The exertion and stress had taken a toll on his already weakened condition, but the fever had not returned, a hopeful sign that the medicines were continuing to work. As Father Domingo brought fresh water and food, Montgomery shared what he had learned during the confrontation with Luther and the sheriff. "Samuel has been released from custody." He began with the good news. "Luther could find no legitimate reason to hold him, but he's being watched closely." "What about the federal authorities?" Stella asked. "Are they still expected in 3 days?" Montgomery's expression grew grimmer. "That's the problem. Luther has sent telegrams east attempting to delay their arrival with reports of Apache unrest in the region." "Will it work?" Nita asked. "Possibly," Montgomery admitted. "Luther has influential friends. At the very least, it creates uncertainty about when help will arrive." Vernon, who had been listening silently, spoke up. "We can't wait then. We need to find the treaty." All eyes turned to him, surprised by his intervention. Despite his weakened state, Vernon's mind remained sharp-focused on the central problem. "If we find the treaty," he continued, "it provides concrete evidence of Luther's motives. Combined with my testimony about Black Mesa and Nita's account of St. Catherine's, it might be enough to convince even the local authorities to move against him." "But where would we even begin looking?" Stella asked. "Luther's office at St. Catherine's," Vernon suggested. "He keeps his most important documents there. I remember seeing a safe behind his desk." "St. Catherine's is 30 miles from here," Montgomery objected, "and heavily guarded, especially now." "Which is why he won't expect us to go there," Vernon countered. "He's focused on finding us in Tucson." The audacity of the suggestion left everyone momentarily speechless. Finally, Nita spoke. "It could work. I know St. Catherine's every hallway, every room. I could find Luther's office." "Absolutely not," Montgomery stated firmly. "It's far too dangerous." "More dangerous than waiting for Luther to find us here?" Vernon asked quietly. "You said yourself he'll be watching the mission now. It's only a matter of time." A heavy silence fell over the group as they considered the impossible choices before them. Stay and be discovered, or risk everything on a desperate gamble to find evidence that might not even exist. Father Domingo, who had been listening quietly, finally offered his perspective. "Sometimes the boldest path is also the wisest. Luther would indeed never expect such a move." "It's settled then," Nita said with a determination that surprised even her. "I'll go to St. Catherine's." "Not alone," Vernon insisted, attempting to sit up despite his injury. "I'm coming with you." You can barely stand, Stella objected. I don't need to stand to provide cover, Vernon replied grimly. Just prop me up with a rifle and I can still shoot. Montgomery shook his head. This is madness. But if you're determined to go, you'll need help. He turned to Father Domingo. Can you send word to Samuel? We'll need horses' supplies and someone who knows the back trails to St. Catherine's. The old priest nodded. It can be arranged. But you realize, Judge, that if you participate in this, you risk everything. Your position, your reputation, perhaps even your freedom. Some principles are worth the risk, Montgomery replied simply. Plans were made quickly with the desperate energy of those who know time is running short. Samuel would meet them outside town at dusk with horses and supplies. Nita and Vernon would travel to St. Catherine's under cover of darkness, while Montgomery would create a distraction in Tucson to draw Luther's attention away from their true destination. As preparations continued around him, Vernon motioned for Nita to come closer to his bedside. You don't have to do this, he said quietly when she sat beside him. You've already risked enough, survived enough. Nita studied his face lined with pain and age, but with eyes that held a new clarity, a purpose that had perhaps been missing for years. This isn't just about me anymore, she replied. It's about justice for my people, for all the children at St. Catherine's, even for you. For me, Vernon's eyebrows rose slightly. For the man who couldn't shoot a child, Nita explained. The man who's been trying to find redemption ever since. Vernon was silent for a long moment, his weathered face working through emotions he seemed unaccustomed to expressing. I don't deserve redemption, he finally said, his voice rough. Not after everything I've done. Perhaps not, Nita agreed, surprising him with her honesty. But you might earn the right to live with yourself, to stop running from the ghosts of Black Mesa. Their eyes held for a moment, Apache survivor and aging bounty hunter bound by a thread of fate. Neither could have imagined 12 years ago on that blood-soaked day. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the mission's whitewashed walls, final preparations were made for the dangerous journey ahead. Father Domingo offered a blessing, his weathered hands extended over Nita and Vernon in a gesture both solemn and hopeful. May God guide your path, the old priest intoned, and bring you safely back with the truth that sets all free. Nita touched the bear fetish at her neck silently, adding her own prayer to the ancestors who watched over her. The path ahead was fraught with danger, the outcome uncertain. But for the first time since her escape from St. Catherine's, she felt a sense of purpose, greater than mere survival. This journey wasn't just about her freedom anymore. It was about justice for her family, for her people, for the truth that had been buried beneath lies and violence for too long. As twilight deepened into dusk, Samuel arrived with horses and supplies, his face showing the strain of recent events, but his spirit undimmed. The time for departure had come. Vernon, supported by Samuel and Montgomery, made his painful way to a sturdy mare selected specifically for her gentle gait. Though his face was pale with effort, his determination never wavered. Once mounted, he straightened as much as his injured leg allowed some echo of the formidable man he had once been visible in his posture. Nita swung easily onto her own horse, the skills Vernon had taught her in those few days at his ranch coming naturally now. She wore clothes borrowed from Stella practical riding attire that allowed freedom of movement with her hair tucked beneath a wide-brimmed hat to help conceal her identity. 3 days, Montgomery reminded them as final adjustments were made to saddles and supplies. If all goes well, return here in 3 days. By then, I should have word about the federal authorities. Nita nodded, understanding all that remained unsaid. If they didn't return in 3 days, it would likely mean they had failed, or worse. As they prepared to ride out, Samuel approached Nita's horse. "There is something you should know before you go," he said quietly. "Something about Vernon that may help you understand him better." "What is it?" Samuel glanced toward Vernon, who was adjusting his splinted leg in the stirrup, then back to Nita. "After Black Mesa, when Luther cast him out, Vernon spent months searching for you, the child he had let escape. He wanted to ensure you had truly survived." Nita's breath caught. "He never told me that." He wouldn't," Samuel replied with a sad smile. "Vernon has always believed his redemption lies in actions, not words, in doing what's right, without seeking credit or forgiveness." The revelation added yet another layer to Nita's complex feelings toward the man who had both participated in her people's destruction and twice saved her life. Before she could respond, Vernon called out that they needed to depart. With final farewells exchanged, they rode out from the mission's sheltering walls into the gathering darkness. The road to St. Catherine's, to confrontation, to truth, to potential justice, lay before them, shadowed and uncertain. But they rode together now, unlikely allies bound by shared purpose, and the tangled threads of a history that had brought them full circle from a burning village 12 years ago to this moment, this chance to heal wounds that had festered for far too long. The desert night enfolded them, vast and ancient and indifferent to human struggles. Yet somewhere in that vastness, Nita sensed her ancestors watching, guiding, perhaps even approving this strange journey toward a justice long denied. With Vernon riding steadily beside her, they disappeared into the darkness, leaving Tucson and its dangers behind. Heading not away from trouble this time, but directly toward its source, armed with courage, determination, and the strength that comes from facing one's deepest fears. The path to redemption. Nita was beginning to understand was rarely straight or simple. But perhaps, in the complex tangle of their shared history, both she and Vernon might find something neither had dared hope for, not just justice, but peace.